We now have Susan Newell to take us through securities law issues. She's an associate in the firm business law section. She is engaged in diverse corporate commercial practices. She's involved in a variety of transactions, including mergers, acquisitions, debt and equity financings, and initial public offerings. She has articled with the firm. She has summered with the firm. She was seconded to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And Susan is doing a wonderful job here. Please help me welcome Susan.
So thanks very much for the introduction. That was lovely. And thank you everyone for still being here. I appreciate you sticking it out. So I'm going to speak mainly about securities law issues, but also touch on some business organization and value drivers as well. So this, hopefully, I've spoken to some of you who already have companies incorporated, so hopefully it will speak directly to you. And I'm not sure what the two prior speakers, their style is, but please feel free to ask questions. If there's anything that I'm talking about that you want to get into right when we're on point, please, by all means, feel free to interrupt me. We'll deal with it right there and then. So, securities law issues. There's a few things that you need to think about. So, in addition to our corporate laws, we also have laws that govern investments into companies. And this securities laws are typically designed in order to protect the investor. That's the policy behind why these laws have been created. And so, some of the things that that means for you is that it's going to impose constraints on what you can do to raise money for your startup. So, the fundamental rule is that no person or company shall trade in a security if the trade would be a distribution unless a preliminary prospectus and final prospectus have been filed and receipts have been issued. And so what that means is a prospectus is a giant disclosure document that basically runs through all kinds of information about your company, and within that you need to follow specific rules as to what you disclose. So that process is very expensive, very lengthy, time-consuming, lots of legals involved, and the good thing is that there are some exemptions that you can rely on instead. Sure.
Sorry, can I just ask a very quick question?
No problem.
What's a security?
A security is it's like a share or an interest. So if it were a company, you could have shares would be a security, an option. It's a right to ownership in an entity.
Thank you.
So that's a very good question. It's sort of the fundamental interest in an entity.
Okay. Thank you.
So when I say security, it would relate to either a share. A common share is the most sort of fundamental one. There's preferred shares, options, warrants, and it goes from there. So that's a very good question right off the bat. So private placements. What is a private placement? A private placement is basically what you have probably heard in the past. It's raising money using an exemption. So a private placement is a distribution of securities that are exempt from the prospectus requirements. And some things to think about are when you're issuing securities, there are resale rules or first trade restrictions that do apply. It puts you into a closed system, meaning that securities are not free trading. So if you are, for example, if you are a company and you're issuing shares to someone, that person can't just run out, take those shares and sell them to whoever they want right off the bat, because they were sold using an exemption. There is a restricted period in which those shares are subject to that restriction, meaning they can't be traded or sold to someone else unless you're relying on another exemption. So that's what the closed system refers to. So what are some of these exemptions and how can you use them? The main ones that we'll see are the capital raising exemption, so accredited investor exemption. This is one that you can sell shares of a company to someone who's an accredited investor without issuing a prospectus. The fundamental sort of reason behind that is an accredited investor is deemed to be sophisticated enough to be able to bear the risk of the investment without needing all that disclosure. So some examples of someone who might be an accredited investor is someone who, over the most recent 2 calendar years, earns $200,000 or more, or combined with a spouse, almost $300,000. Another exemption that we sometimes see is having net assets of in excess of $5 million. So these are the sorts of people that might qualify as an accredited investor. There's other different, a laundry list of different things you can hit to be an accredited investor. The private issuer exemption is one that might be applicable to some of your companies that you could use. A private issuer is an issuer that's not a reporting issuer, so you're not trading on any exchanges. There's exemption, restrictions on transfer. That's typically going to be in your articles of incorporation or your incorporating documents, and you have not more than 50 shareholders. Another one that's commonly used right at the beginning of a company's existence is the founder, control person, and family exemption. That's what it's called in Ontario. I also have one of those nice books like David with all of our millions of rules, and it's different across all the provinces, but this one that is specific to Ontario, there's a similar one in other provinces. And this is where a founder, a control person, or a family exemption, so if it's a brother, sister, grandparent, grandchild of an executive officer, a director, or a founder, then you can invest without having a prospectus. Another one is $150,000. If you're lucky enough to, or talented enough to have someone going to invest $150,000 in one shot, you can rely on that exemption.
But could it be 150 and less?
It has to be more. 150 is more. Yeah. So if you hit that 150 or higher, you could rely on that exemption. But if it's below 150, you need to use a different exemption.
But wouldn't it be like an accredited investor at that point? Because they have a lot of net worth.
You could be investing $150,000 and still not hit the accredited investor test.
Okay.
So maybe someone has only earned that amount in the last year. So oftentimes, if someone is investing $150,000, just from a practical perspective, they typically have access to a lot of money, but it doesn't necessarily always line up.
So could I go to a crowdfunding site and raise $150,000 without any concern?
No, it has to be. It has to be one purchase, one issuance of shares to one investor, and it can't be someone that's created just for the purpose of so you can't just get everyone to pool their money together in order to use that exemption. That wouldn't work. There's also transaction exemptions, so sometimes would be maybe a business combination or a takeover bid could fit into this specific exemption. And then lastly, another common one that's used is the employee, executive officers, directors, and consultant exemptions. And if you're relying on that, you just need to make sure that those people are a bona fide employee or consultant, and that you're not.
Can they become an employee after they lent the money in exchange for security?
It depends how you structure it. I think you would want to make sure that that you have they're an employee. You can sometimes issue options depending on what you're doing, but if you're issuing shares, you want to be sure that they fit squarely within the exemption before you issue them shares. So it might be something like you might sign up in an employee agreement at the same time, and maybe they haven't yet commenced actually working, but they become an employee as of that time.
And then they have the options for shares.
Yeah, so you just want to make sure that it's something that fits quite squarely. You want to be careful with these rules that you're right within them and it's not almost there. So next we're going to move on to some of the business organization and value drivers, and I think probably some of these main points Craig might have touched on right at the beginning, but I think they're pretty important, so there's a lot to get through. So value drivers. So operating in organizational factors that have a significant value impact and are controllable. To maximize enterprise value, adopt best practices with respect to your value drivers from the genesis of your business. And this is something that's very important to hammer home, and it's also very tricky because at the beginning of your business, you don't have a ton of money to be spending on legal fees and accountants and everything else. And unfortunately, that's the time when it's really important to make sure you get things set up properly and get things done correctly. It's so much more expensive, and I can't even emphasize that enough, to fix something later than it is to do it cleanly and crisply from the very beginning. So that's sort of a theme that I'm going to unfortunately keep coming back to, but it is amazing how much easier things will be on you if you get things set up in a clean, transparent, comprehensive way from the beginning. And that goes to the next one, is to seek guidance from experienced professionals. So how should things be aligned with shareholder composition and management? So I think Craig spoke briefly about the difference between a shareholder and management and directors. There's all sort of have a distinct role. One thing that you want to avoid from the very beginning is having too many shareholders. So And the reason being is that every shareholder has their own interest, every shareholder has their own point of view, and to the extent you can limit that and limit the number of voices that are involved, it makes things much more attractive to someone who's going to come in and maybe potentially give you a more significant investment. And if at the beginning you're in a position where you need to have a lot of shareholders in order to make your business plan work properly, you want to make sure that there's voting trusts or a unanimous shareholders agreement in place. So some kind of agreement that says we're all going to vote in this one way. And that's what a voting trust does. Everybody who signs on, this is how we're going to deal with these issues when they arise. Let's get it out of the way ahead of time. There's no surprises. There aren't those, maybe you've got 20 people involved. You don't have 20 voices anymore. You've got one, and it's comprehensive, and it's clear, and it's all in that one document. It sets out how things are going to be, how things are going to run. And this leads to efficient decision making. It also leads to transparency, and it alleviates a lot of concern for someone who's potentially going to come in with a larger investment. They can see what they're dealing with right off the bat. Keep share capital structure simple. So this is something, again, that sometimes people get excited about when they've got their new company and they think it's easy at the beginning to sort of judge who's contributed more, who's worth more, and there's sometimes a temptation to give different share classes. So just to backtrack to the very beginning, common share is the usual type of share that you would have, which has usually it's one vote per common share held. You can also do, there's preferred shares, so sometimes there's different classes of shares. Sometimes there's multiple classes of shares and that some pay dividends, some don't. Options, which is basically a right to buy a share at a later date for a specific price. Phantom equity plans, so that would be something that you would sometimes have issue equity to, usually it's employees. And all of these increase the complexity of negotiation with investors. So the more time it takes you to explain what's going on with your shareholder base, the more tricky it is for someone to find it easy to buy in. And along the same lines, minimize dilution drivers. So you can think about this dilution, and this is something that some of you probably are familiar with already, so it's probably old news, but it's basically when you're a shareholder of a company, you own a piece of the pie. So if your piece is this big, and the pie is this big, you know exactly what percentage you have of the company and where you fit. If there's all kinds of options out there, and all of a sudden all those options get exercised, now the pie is this big, but your piece is still this big. So you just own less of the company. So you want to really limit the amount of dilution that's possible so that an investor doesn't come in thinking, well, there's 100 shares outstanding, but there's options floating around out there somewhere for another 100 shares. So if I come in at 10%, all of a sudden I'm just going to be diluted down to a very small share ownership. So it's just something to think about when issuing shares or options and warrants, that you don't want too much of that overhang out there that it makes your company an unattractive investment. So that's fully diluted is the calculation, which is the number of shares you have outstanding and then the number of other securities that are exercisable into common shares. So that would be things like an option, which is a right to buy another share. So if all of those options are exercised, that's your fully diluted number. Create ability to accelerate the vesting of options and warrants. And this is something that I think is pretty important. Usually options are governed by an agreement. So sometimes people think it is a great way to incentivize employees or management, certainly. What you want to make sure that you're doing is if you're issuing shares or options to an employee saying you have the right to buy shares at this price going forward, even if the value of the company increases, you want to tie that usually to if they leave the company. If they leave the company for cause, typically their option should terminate immediately. But if they leave the company of their own accord, usually there's a period of time in there, maybe 30 days, in which they can still exercise their option. So that at the end of the day, you aren't sitting there with 100 options outstanding, and they're all to this employee that left your company 4 years ago, and now they work somewhere else, and you haven't talked to them in 4 years, and these options are still sort of floating out there, and it just is better to right up front to make sure the terms are clear and that you can accelerate investing or that they can terminate early. Create the ability to compel crystallization or conversion or exchange rates held by existing or equity or debt holders. So if you do have conversion rights. So maybe you've got preferred shares that after the company makes a certain amount of money, those preferred shares can convert into common shares. You want to make sure that you have the ability to say when that will happen and have control over that event. Limit shareholder vetoes. So this ties back to the slide a few slides ago when we talked about limiting the number of voices. Sure.
Quick question. Can you just tell more about the difference between options and warrants?
Sure. So it's the same idea behind options and warrants, in that both are a right to purchase a security at a future date. Typically options are issued to employees or consultants, directors, and whereas warrants are issued to the public more often, and it can overlap, but you wouldn't issue options to someone that you don't know down the street. Similarly, you could only issue warrants to someone if they fit within one of those exemptions, unless you have a prospectus. So it's the same idea, but you might do, sometimes a company would do issue units, which is a share and a warrant together, in which case you'd issue that to the public or under using an exemption, one or the other. So that would be a warrant rather than an option. But it's the same idea behind both, in that there's a right to purchase security at some point in the future for a specific price, and usually there's warrants are less likely to have vesting. They don't have vesting, but they'll have acceleration provisions. They'll have termination provisions. The same concept applies.
So for investors, it would be warrants.
Yeah, if it's an investor who's not an employee, you could issue warrants. But if you were doing that, you would need to make sure that you fit under one of the exemptions, because it is still a security. And that it's typically, because if you were issuing to an investor is, depending on who your investor is, but it's a tougher sell to say you can buy this, but all you're buying is an option to buy at a price. Usually if someone's coming in, especially at the beginning, they would want to share right off the bat, rather than the right to, because they'd be purchasing that right. So it depends. It depends what the pricing is and how it works, but it's more rare to see an issuance of warrants. Okay, so limiting shareholder vetoes, this goes back to having, how many voices are you going to have at the table? And it complicates a control analysis, so this meaning if you've got a large investor coming in, you want to limit the number of people that can veto that from happening. And typically you could set out a very comprehensive shareholders agreement, an agreement between shareholders as to how you're going to deal with those situations if they do arise. Creates a conflict dynamic in structuring discussion. So again, you could have different objectives at play. So try to avoid secured debt obligations. And this is, again, these are all, some of this might be, wishful thinking to some extent, but sophisticated investors, if that's who you're targeting, they often will seek to liquidate preferences and use their own secured debt. And sometimes, again, you've got concerns about whether a control person is represented. So if there's prior secured debt, if you already have debt out there issued to a whole bunch of people and that's secured as the first debt that's going to get paid off, it could really become a bit of a deterrent for other investors coming in. And shareholder loans are often another unique problem, and there could be real or perceived conflicts of interest. So that would be, sometimes a shareholder loan is your own investment into your own company. You might choose to put money into your company in the way of a loan. A lot of times buyers don't find that as attractive because they don't want to be indebted to you. They don't want the company indebted to you if you do end up selling the company or a piece of the company. And the perceived or real conflicts of interest often happens with, if you've got a shareholder with loans outstanding, they might be a larger voice trying to limit some of the other things the company might be doing that someone without those shareholder loans outstanding would consider appropriate.
If you've self-funded your company, then obviously there's a large shareholder loan. So there is a large loan or debt of the company to yourself as the only shareholder, and I would think that's fairly standard, because the money would have had to come from somewhere other than not from yourself or from other people who have shares because they've loaned money to the company.
It depends, yeah, it depends how you put that money in. So if you put that money in for shares, so right off the bat, if you said, I'm putting in $100 and I'm getting issued 100 shares, they're at $1 a piece, that's not a loan.
Right.
You've put the money in, but you hold that equity. So if you're just putting money in as a loan that you expect at the end of the day you're going to get paid back, you just want to make sure that's documented properly.
Right.
And it's all there.
And that's a problem, as you're saying, for future investors?
It can be.
Because they just see that the company owes like $300,000. The company has a debt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, your company's going to need to start somewhere, right? It makes perfect sense that there is. This is more along the lines of best practice and trying to limit that or make it as streamlined as possible. You probably wouldn't want to have shareholder loans outstanding with a number of people or directors with different amounts outstanding. Those sorts of things can lead to more complication. But if you do have loans, you're at that beginning stage, and you put money in that at the end of the day you expect to see back, you need to make sure that you're documenting that properly so that when you do get another investor in, they don't say, what do you mean the company owes you? I have no idea. So just something to make sure that it gets papered properly. So, liquidation bombs. Avoid them. Concerns are raised by investors with shareholder puts, third-party debt maturities, pre-existing priority liquidation rights, shareholder exit plans, and triggers and material contracts. So let's break that down a little bit. Pre-existing priority liquidation rights, meaning that maybe you have multiple classes of shares, and if the company were to liquidate, people get paid out at different times. That can sometimes cause a concern. Shareholder exit plans, this is typically designed around unintentional exits, such as maybe death or disability. Sometimes you might have two shareholders that are involved in a company and they made the decision, they're in this together, they own the same amount, they're both directors on the board, and then if one person gets a divorce, now what happens to their shares? Sometimes people end up with business partners they didn't necessarily intend to be in a business with. So a shareholder agreement can help you with that, but you'll want to make sure these are some of the things that might pop up along the way. Triggers and material contracts, that's a bit different. Again, this is just trying to keep as many third parties out of what you're doing. So if you do end up using an agent or an investment banker to help you find money right off the bat, oftentimes you'll sign an engagement letter with them. You just want to make sure you're aware of what you're signing yourself up for. A lot of the times there'll be a right of first refusal in there saying that for the next year, every time you raise capital, they get 7% of that. So you just want to make sure that you know what your material contracts say. Another thing to watch out for in your material contracts, so material contracts being the most important contracts to your company, maybe what you do involves one service provider, and that's really important. Without that service provider, you can't go forward. Be careful that if you have a change of control provision in that contract that requires their consent, basically they could hold up a transaction and tell you, no, you can't sell your company because it's in my contract that you're going to get my consent first and I'm not consenting. So just be aware of what's in your material contracts from the very beginning. That might be a contract you structured at the very beginning without thinking that down the road maybe you are going to sell the company. So just be aware of what's there and what could potentially come back and haunt you in the future. Another thing about shareholder exit plans and other sort of surprises is if there's one person, and maybe that person is you, who is fundamental to the business, and if that person leaves, then the business is in huge trouble. Maybe you've got a particular inventor or designer that you need to run the business. A consideration you might think about is whether it makes sense to get key person insurance and be insured if that person leaves. Sometimes it's for a specific period of time or a specific amount, just to make sure that the company can continue in that person's absence while you find a replacement. And again, the key thing you want to avoid is external threats to stability, so wild cards, any third-party dependency or exposure. You want to make sure that you limit it and you know exactly what's there and what you're looking at. So this is one that seems, more along the business lines and the legal lines, but there are still some legal implications. Ensure management's adequately incentivized and engaged. So usually it's helpful if you're an investor you like to know that the inventors and people who are running the company have some skin in the game, and that they have invested, and they sometimes, not to speak out of both sides of my mouth here, but sometimes options are good to have. If your designer has options that vest over 3 years, and 3 years from now they have the right to acquire security in your company, that's a good thing, because it shows investors that your interests are aligned. Everybody wants the company to succeed. And along the same lines, you might consider target thresholds in compensation, or options, or bonuses aligned with company's performance. It's really important from the outset to have things documented in paper and structured properly, and having good agreements. It can, obviously there's going to be some kind of cost involved, but if you can get a customer contract that's a form of contract that you can use over and over and over again, and maybe you have a couple different intros for, maybe you've got some people you use as consultants and some use as employees, and you just have the same standard contract that you can use on your own a number of times. There is an initial cost, but the value in reusing those agreements can certainly circle back. And reflecting value systems, priorities of business, and key stakeholders in agreements. So, for example, the USA or the Unanimous Shareholders Agreement, sometimes you can set out in those agreements how things are going to be structured and what the priorities of the business are. So transparency and accountability, those are two huge issues, and it does seem, you know, maybe not the most practical. If you're the only director, do you really need board minutes? Well, the answer is that yes, you should have them, so that when someone comes in later, they can see what you did and why, especially with respect to share issuances. Even if you're the only director and you're the only shareholder and you're issuing yourself shares, you need to make sure that you document that so that it's very clean and crisp. On this date, this many shares were issued for this amount, and then this investor came in and they bought this amount of shares, so that it's all very clear. And that's something that you can't just fix that 5 years from now, go back and say, well, yeah, I think we issued shares then, so let's just say that we did. It all needs to be documented clearly and transparently. And similarly with shareholder meetings, you want to make sure that you're in compliance with the Act, and the Act, I mean the Corporate Act, as to when you need to have shareholder meetings, and make sure that you actually are giving your shareholders the financial statements and the sorts of things that are in the Corporate Act. And reflecting strong financial literacy and discipline with excellent financial records management and organization. Same idea as your minute books and your legal books, is keep the same thing with your financial records. And I recognize that these are very basic, sort of fundamental things, but it's amazing how easy it is when you're working on the business side of things to not paper these details along the way, and how much of a disaster that can be down the road if you don't keep on top of the sort of the boring day-to-day stuff. And avoid leaving it too late, because although it's counterintuitive that you would be putting money into something before you're getting money back, it will save you so much time and so much heartache. If you've got an investor coming in and wants to invest in your company and says, oh, can I just take a look at your minute books, and you don't have a minute book, you're gonna need to come up with one, and it's gonna take time away from what you're trying to do. It's gonna give the impression that you're not organized and you haven't thought things through. If someone says, I'd like to take a look at your minute books, and you can say, sure, no problem, here it is, it's all up to date, that is a very impressive thing. And I have seen before investors walk because it took too long to produce a minute book, which I know sounds silly, but it was just sort of went back to the idea that, you know, they sort of were interested, and then they saw it took too long, and they said, if you can't produce a minute book in that long, how can I go forward? How can I trust that you're gonna, you know, be a reasonable person to do business with? So it seems silly, but it can be pretty fundamental. Along the same lines, you'll want to update your business plan and include a comprehensive summary. And these sorts of things are very important to present yourself as a together company. Sometimes, even if you've got a fantastic idea and a fantastic product, if you're not able to present yourself in such a way that people are going to buy into it, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So obtain guidance You want corporate goodwill as opposed to personal goodwill. And some of the other considerations, I think David already touched on some of these employment and consulting agreements, but I'm just going to go back to basics here and make sure those are papered, not only for your protection and between you and the employee and you and the consultant, but also from a third party's perspective. If they can see exactly what is out there, who's being paid what, how they're incentivized, when they're getting bonuses, when they're getting options, how everything looks, and it's clean and crisp, you're going to be in a much better position for having someone come in and want to invest in your company. Similarly, securing intellectual property. This is huge and really important, and again, something that gets overlooked because people think, well, I'll just run my business for a while, get my feet under me, get myself together, and once I'm operating, then I'll consider going down this road. But by then, you've spent the last maybe year, 3 years, 5 years in that process, making all these contacts along the way, presenting yourself and your business with a certain name, and then you find out that actually you're infringing on someone else's trademark and you need to start from scratch. And those searches are important to do right off the bat to make sure that you're not setting yourself up not only to not have it, but to be sued by somebody else. And protection from creditors and debtors, again, just make sure everything's papered properly. And preparing for a merger, sale, or IPO, that's something that if you wait until someone's interested to try to prepare for it, you're not going to be able to do your appropriate business pitches and clean up all the legal, bookkeeping, boring day-to-day stuff at the same time. If you do that ahead of time and are ready at any time, then when a fabulous opportunity presents itself, you're there and ready to go right off the bat. That's all. Does anyone have any questions? Anything? It was all very clear.
Well, skin in the game. Let's say I'm the founder of the project.
Okay.
I do all the work, but I have an investor coming to the table and he's asking me how much you're going to put in the company. And I don't have any money, but I'm ready to work for the project.
Great.
From your practice, what would be the skin in the game legally from my side?
From your side, so your services, right? So you're prepared to work for the company.
Let's say I'm the founder, I'm the director, and I'm going to be running the company.
Right, and an investor's coming in, and so you want to show that you've got skin in the game?
Yeah.
That's what you're saying? So maybe you might have an employment contract or some kind of document papering that. And
for investors, I understand the most important skin in the game, the money I put on the table.
Sweat equity.
sorry?
Sweat equity.
Oh, sweat equity. So you just want to make sure that you have that documented in such a way that it's clear that your services and that is worth something, and that's worth value, whether or not it's money.
So any advisors, like particularly like
Any sort of number that you put on that, or?
I don't know, just from your practice, what would be the best way to put it in the agreement?
I think it depends on you be structuring your company, so how much of your company are you going to give to the investor? That's one thing you need to think about, which you probably already know a percentage of what that's going to look like. And then you could issue them shares in a percentage that works with the number of shares that you have as well, so that you have it set up in such a way that it covers both of your interests. You also might need someone from the financial side to advise you as to what your company's worth if you already know that, you have that number in mind.
Well, it's easy if you've been on the market for a long time, but if you start out, that's impossible.
Yeah.
No matter what. Thanks.
As far as minute books are concerned, you mentioned it's basically just recording your organization's key activities throughout the period. Is that all it is, or is that something more that you need to put on there?
There's a little bit more. So is it a company that you're talking about? So if you're an incorporated company, you're governed under a specific act. So it's maybe the Ontario Business Corporations Act or the Canadian Business Corporations Act. There's a number of requirements under that act of things that you need to do as a company. Being every year you need to have a meeting, you need to appoint your auditors or dispose with, if you're a private company, you don't have to. So there's things like that you need to do from a corporate perspective. You need to document share issuances, should be documenting board meetings, and board minutes don't need to be a verbatim, this is everything that was talked about, but if any resolutions were passed, if you're entering into any material contracts to your company, the board should be approving those sorts of things. So it's a history of all the important corporate steps. You should make sure that you have a shareholder register setting out who the shareholders are, what date they were issued shares and when. You need a director register, who the directors are, what date they might have resigned, any director resignations, officer appointments, all those sorts of pieces. So it is a record of the day-to-day sort of operation, but it's more just with respect to the corporate operations and how that
And the
plays
good
out.
guideline you mentioned is from the Ontario Corporations Act, is that right?
Yeah, it depends
reference?
where your company is incorporated. So, yeah, if it's, sometimes there's also the Canadian Business Corporations Act, which people in Ontario choose usually either or, Ontario or Canada. So make sure that you're looking at the one that matches with what your articles say. That's a fairly big book, but there are some, within that book, it will refer to what you need to do. Your shareholders have certain rights as to what they're entitled to be provided, financial statements being one of them on an annual basis. And so ideally you have the shareholders adopting the financial statements every year.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Sure, I'll go here first.
What's your, I'm sure you've been going through a lot of case studies, what's your most common issue that keeps coming?
With problems that, I'll say most commonly, and the bigger problem is with respect to shares being issued without valid consideration. So if you're going to issue shares, there needs to be money paid. Sometimes it can be a nominal amount, but there needs to actually be money paid, or you can, past services can work. That can be valid. You just need to say it's worth a certain value, which matches what the shares will be worth. So a lot of the time we'll see shares are being issued, but there's no director's resolution approving it, or shares are being transferred, but there's a restriction in your articles that say that you can't transfer them without director's consent. So the most common issue is we get minute books, and it sets out on September 1st, 5 shares were issued to John, and then on September 6th, there's 1,000 shares outstanding and we have no idea where they went. Or all of a sudden someone's got a share certificate for 1 million shares. How did they get that? What's going on? Where did this come from? So you need to be able to track how that happened, and basically a share is the ownership of the company. And it doesn't really matter who the directors are. If the shareholders change, they can appoint whoever they want as directors.
Right.
So
you spoke about the structure,
Mhm.
saying it's very important. So for startups, especially when people like us are just starting, we're never really
Yeah.
thinking about the whole shareholders agreement and everything
right.
coming in the future. But how would you advise about doing it from the get-go kind of thing? You know, when you're getting into the whole agreements and everything, you would assign some, like a section keeping in mind that that's going to go to investors from the beginning, or do you get, as your company grows, do you review your whole, you know what I mean?
What
So,
do you do from
yeah,
a practical perspective? Yeah, I know this is not necessarily the most helpful answer, but get legal advice, because every situation is different. Maybe for you, you've got a couple people, maybe it's just you, and it can be tailored to your specific situation and your specific circumstances. Always be thinking about the unexpected, which I know is hard to say. What happens if one of those people has now a new interest or decides they're going to move and do something different? How is that going to impact things? So it's hard to say. A shareholders agreement can be anywhere from 2 pages to 100 pages with all different rights and decision-making powers anywhere along the spectrum. So it is very situation specific. From a very broad sort of 500-foot view is just be thinking about, be careful with your share capital, be careful with rights you're issuing people in your share capital, and always be thinking about how that's going to look down the road and how that's going to create an issue for you down the road. Although I'm sure it's exciting to have investors, you want to make sure that they're coming in such a way that you're not putting yourself at risk or going to disadvantage you. And I know that that's not very specific advice, but I think if you, to the extent you can, find someone to steer you in the right direction for your circumstances that may be helpful. Thank you.
Just go back very briefly to what you were saying about keeping minutes. Am I right in thinking then what you're saying is whenever you make a decision that impacts the company, even if it's not during a board meeting, you still need to take minutes of that?
It depends what it is. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. Like ordinary course of business, you don't need to be.
Sure.
And then I picked up some staples for the company. Like, those sorts of things you obviously don't need to be documenting. But if it's an important decision that doesn't happen, often you won't be issuing shares at your board meeting. It'll happen at another time.
Yeah.
That would need to be documented. And you would do that without minutes, it would be a resolution. So it's a similar, minutes of a meeting is keeping track. A resolution is a written.
So I could just write a resolution that I will give myself 1 million shares.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you would say, I've received consideration, and you just need to make sure that you could just write that, and
Sure.
that would
Okay.
be
Thank you.
sort of an answer. Was that question?
Yeah. So if you're a startup, what would you say is the safe number of shares to start with?
The number of shares
Yeah.
really doesn't matter. I would say it's safe to do, you want your articles to say you can issue an unlimited number of shares. Because in Ontario and under the Canada and Ontario Act, there's no cost associated with that. So I think it's easier if you just have that unlimited number. But then within that, it doesn't matter how many shares, because if you have 1 share in your company and there's 1 shareholder and there's 1 share issued, the company's still worth the same as if you have 1 million shares, right? Because what the company's worth is what the company's worth. It's more percentage-wise how things line up. So it's people choose to do it different ways. Usually off the bat, you wouldn't start with 1 million, just because then you need to go to 2 million. It's just harder to. Normally you start with the smaller numbers, but what that number is, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference one bit if there's 1 share outstanding or there's 100 shares outstanding.
Any more questions? Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks so much for
Thank
having me.